Hey, I'm aware that my face is a little sunburnt. I foolishly went outside the other day and did not wear sunscreen, despite being offered some. I'm not a smart man. Hey, Rainy Joe here, and this is 1001 Reviews, where I plan to review every album from the 1001 albums to listen to before you die. Today we're looking at Scott Walker's 1968 album, Scott 2. Now, Scott 2 by Scott Walker was released under the Philips label, produced by John Franz and Peter J. Olaf, with art direction uncredited, nationality USA, with a running time of 43 minutes and 47 seconds. The blurb reads, "Putting me in front of a camera," Scott Walker once mused, "is like taking a hermit who has lived in a cave and suddenly standing him in Trafalgar Square." Think I can relate to that one. However, it was not only Walker's profound aversion to attention that led him to leave the Walker Brothers in 1967. He had, he believed, richer records in him than the Spectresque ballads, all covers, which with the band he had led peppered the British charts since 1965. Ravishing orchestral arrangements drew the public to Scott, his 1967 solo debut, although those who listened closely to the jumble of covers and originals found a headily introspective record. Scott 2 continued the theme with a similar mix of material to greater effect. The straighter covers, among them a bleak reading of Bacharach and David's Windows of the World, kept Walker Brothers fans happy, but the real gems lie elsewhere, in the trio of Jacques Brel songs, led by galloping opener Jackie, and the quartet of pieces written by Walker himself. The singer's decision to credit his songs to S. Engel, his real surname, lent credence to the suspicion that cuts like the haunting Plastic Palace people were autobiographical. Scott 2 was Walker's most commercially successful solo album, but also the point at which he started to lose his public. Following the more cohesive but less consistent Scott 3 came Scott 4, a dense collection of self-penned material. It failed to chart, leading Walker into a creative decline not fully broken until 1995's overwhelming Tilt, which I may talk about one day. Written by WFJ being Will Fulford Jones. Will Fulford Jones spends his days editing travel guides for London's Time Out and his evenings writing about music. Like the book says, Scott 2 carries on the consistency and ideas from Scott 1, where Scott would do some of his own original material, film songs, and covers of Belgian musician Jacques Brel songs, which, with the Scott Walker compositions as well as the Jacques Brel covers, is where Scott Walker shines best, not so much the film songs, which I will get into later. The Jacques Brel covers show just how willing to be on edge Scott Walker was, kind of pushing the envelope both lyrically and instrumentally. The lyrics in some of these songs are very provocative and disturbing for some, which was something that in the 60s was sort of frowned upon. Most musicians kind of strayed away from getting too political or too sexually suggestive. I guess unless they were being sexist, to be honest. For example, one of my favorite songs on here is a Jacques Brel cover called Next, in which the narrator of the song is a boy being used for prostitution in the army. He is in line to be used by the soldiers for their sexual purposes and is constantly being hailed next, next, next as the line further approaches him, adding to this building up tension of the track. The lyrics here are also incredibly depraved and disturbing in just how vivid they paint a picture of this story. For example, of just how disturbing and descriptive these depraved lyrics are, you get stuff like, "I swear on the wet head of my first case of gonorrhea, it's his ugly voice that I forever hear. Next, next, that voice that stinks of corpses, of whiskey and of mud. It is the voice of nations, that thick voice of blood." This very vivid and disturbing description, sung by Scott Walker, is sung with his very deep baritone-like voice, adding to the strength of the lyrics. It is sung almost operatic-like. He blasts out from deep below, kind of adding so much oomph to his lyrics here. And his very foreboding, deep voice kind of adds to the tension of the track even more so. There's also a xylophone used in this track, kind of cascading back and forth, also adding to the tension. This is one of the most tense tracks on the album, but is also one of the most incredibly well written and well performed ones on here, and is actually my favorite of the album. Another favorite of mine on the album is the Jacques Brel song Jackie, which is the opener of the album. Jackie opens up with a very galloping instrumentation and is far more upbeat than the other songs on here, but also makes references to drugs and to provocative like lyrics that actually got it banned by the BBC for being too provocative. It's funny how at the time drugs were frowned upon, but now drugs are here in every facet of every genre. It is a very common trope now, but back then it was rather too much for the radio. But even still, this song Jackie, despite being banned by the BBC, was well praised and given much attention to by the general public in the UK especially, which it very much deserves for just how powerful Scott's voice is and for how beautiful the orchestra arrangements are on this song. And these two covers, Next and Jackie, are perfect introductions and perfect for showing the English listeners an artist who they might not be familiar with, the Belgian singer Jacques Brel. But Jacques Brel cover songs aside, we get Scott Walker's original compositions, which are the second strongest point of this album, as Scott Walker's lyrics are just as powerful and also just as beautiful as how disturbing Jacques Brel can be, if that makes any sense. You get highlights like the song Best of Both Worlds, a song about a man who is seeing a woman who is currently also seeing another man. And in this song, Scott is telling her, you must pick between one of us. You cannot have the best of both worlds. Make your choice, or this will not end well. With this incredibly dramatic story being given here, Scott gives off his very operatic-like voice, kind of giving off to the drama. And with this, it is also perfectly lifted with the orchestra arrangements on here as well. It has these string-like arpeggios which constantly descend after he belts out the best of both worlds line, and even the way Scott Walker uses interesting and strange inflections in his voice on specific words. For example, the way he pronounces the word enjoy is inflected upon and not pronounced in a natural way, and it kind of gives the personality and distinction that this song deserves. Something Scott Walker often does is inflections in his voice to pronounce words in strange or unusual ways, never just saying them flatly. But then we have another song called Plastic Palace People, which is another Scott Walker original and is probably on a technical level the most impressive of the album, as you get what feels like three songs melded into one. It begins with these hushed tones where he is singing much softer, not as operatic as he was earlier, but then in the chorus of the song, it belts out much louder, much more naturally, not being very hushed. But my favorite part of the song is actually the bridge, where instead of being hushed or being very natural, it is now eerie. He takes away the normal instrumentation and instead makes everything feel very ominous in tone. He does this by layering his voice multiple times over, so he is singing over himself, and each voice is actually singing with a wavery-like effect. This ominous, disturbing, and unsettling tone is kind of beautiful in just how strange and absurd it seems. But I do want to note that this way of singing and this kind of performance is something that seems very indicative of what Scott Walker would later do in his career with things like Tilt, The Drift, and Bish Bosh, albums that I will talk about one day for sure. And really, I do think that with moments like this, they show off Scott Walker's genius as a songwriter and a musician overall. The way he can perfectly arrange different sounds and styles along with the instruments kind of creates this massive scale effect. But then at the end of the day, there are the weakest tracks on here, which are things like Wait Until Dark and Come Next Spring, both being film songs. I do feel like these songs are filler tracks and a little unnecessary to even have on the album, as the runtime is already at 42 minutes. You could cut off these two and not lose too much. They are much more bland instrumentally and also do not do anything unique or original with Scott's voice. his voice is sung very simply on these two, which end up making them just feel like filler tracks overall and very much not needed. I won't get too much into some of the other tracks here as I don't want to stretch this video too long, but I do recommend also checking out the song The Morris Humphrey Plug, because it is probably by far one of the more accessible tracks on here and is almost Neil Diamond-esque. If you are a fan of Neil Diamond, I recommend checking out the Morris Humphrey Plug, as it kind of gives off those sort of tones and is also maybe one of the more simpler songs, but is still done very impressively by Scott Walker. That all being said, this album's high points when it's playing to Scott Walker's strengths is incredibly high. It hits all the sweet spots and doesn't really let up in any way, and for that, I do think it is deserving of all the praise it gets, especially in terms of Baroque Pop, because the orchestra arrangements really put the word Baroque into Baroque Pop. This is an incredible album of the Baroque Pop genre and is definitely a must-listen for fans of such. This album's soft rating comes in at a 7 out of 10, but given just how incredible the highlights of this album are, things like Next, Jackie, A Morris Humphrey Plug, Plastic Palace People, and even songs like The Girls from the Streets are so powerful and true highlights that the low points like Come Next Spring and Wait Until Dark are overshadowed by them. So for that, I will adjust the rating in Heart in It up to an 8 out of 10. And I will also say that this is an essential album. It is essential to listen to, as I do find overall this is one of few Baroque Pop albums in the book, and I think Baroque Pop in general is a underrated genre and deserves more attention by the masses. Yes, it is an acquired taste for sure, and it is not for everyone, but I see no harm in listening to this album, as it is one of the best from it, and if you enjoy it, you've now just discovered a whole new genre, a whole genre that you can now explore and enjoy yourself. So for that, definitely essential, and 8 out of 10. The next album we are listening to is number 966, which ends up being Portishead's album Third. You could listen to that album and see the review for that in exactly 1 week from now on Tuesday. And this Friday we have Anthrax's Among the Living. This has been Randy Joe, signing off.